A smug judge derides a teenager in court, assuming him to be nothing more than a delinquent. But moments later, the courtroom is stunned into silence, because the boy is not who they think he is. He's not intimidated, not nervous. Instead, he begins dissecting the case like a seasoned lawyer, leaving even the prosecutor speechless. What could have caused the entire justice system to balk at his presence? Follow along to the end. What happens next is not what you expect. Before we delve into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailor-made for you. The story begins. Judge Grayson thought he was presiding over a simple case of a misguided youth, until the defendant began dissecting the case like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. The spectator seats were packed, a murmur rippling through the crowd as everyone watched the proceedings intently. The defendant's table seemed too large for the young man standing beside it. Hands tucked into his pockets, chin tilted just enough to indicate that he was not the least bit afraid. Elijah Dawson, age 19, was charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Henry Grayson looked at him suggested this trial was about more than just the law. He leaned back in his chair, fingers lazily drumming against the polished wood of the bench, eyes peering down at Elijah over his glasses, a smirk playing on his lips that was somewhere between amusement and disdain. Do you think you're some kind of legal expert? This isn't a debate club, kid. A few laughs echoed through the courtroom. From the bailiff, the court clerk, even the prosecutor. They all saw it as a joke. But Elijah didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this specific moment. He never intended to be standing here as a defendant. But he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids were into basketball, he was memorizing legal precedents. While his friends played video games, he was practicing self-advocacy in his head, staging mock trials, arguing with himself. His mother, Monica Dawson, had worked as a legal assistant for over 20 years. He grew up on her stories about how prosecutors twisted the law, about biased judges, about defense attorneys who didn't even bother to try. He absorbed it all. By the time he was 14, he could analyze a trial better than most law students. But to Grayson, none of that mattered. In his eyes, Elijah was just a delinquent. Let's wrap this up quickly, the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. I have a tea time at 2. Another round of laughter echoed through the room. But this time, something shifted. The corner of Elijah's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. The rest of the courtroom, however, was still oblivious. Thomas Carrington, the prosecutor, rose with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice exuding the kind of practiced confidence that comes from hundreds of speeches. Your Honor, the prosecution will prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, Elijah Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his apprehension. Police pursued him across the downtown area where he allegedly attempted to evade capture before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself. The words landed heavily. The audience in the courtroom shifted, murmurs erupting. On the surface, it all seemed cut and dried. A stolen car, a chase, a runaway. Judge Grayson glanced at Elijah over his glasses, then turned to Carrington. Proceed. Carrington strode toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson was simply an unfortunate victim of circumstance. He paused, looking directly at Elijah for the first time. But let's be real. What kind of victim runs from the police? The air in the courtroom suddenly crackled with tension. Sure. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his hand. Elijah didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of documents. Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Brian Ruiz, who witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee. The vehicle was confirmed to be stolen. The arrest was entirely lawful. Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. Sounds open and shut. And to most in the room it did. A clear-cut case, a stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Elijah had spent too many years studying trials not to recognize the cracks. Still, he remained silent, observing, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly on the bench. All right, let's hear the rebuttal from the defense. He turned to Elijah's lawyer, a public defender, Rebecca Thornton, who hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences since entering the courtroom. She rose, looking a little flustered. Your Honor, my client. A hand gently touched her arm. Elijah, a silent request. Thornton hesitated. Then she sat down, and for the first time Elijah spoke. I will represent myself, Your Honor. The room fell silent. Grayson looked at him, clearly amused. What did you just say? Elijah's voice was calm, steady. I will represent myself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. Carrington's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing as Elijah stepped forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the room seemed to press down on him as he adjusted his posture. Hands still in his pockets, he let the silence stretch out a little longer, just enough to make them impatient. Then finally he spoke. Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to clarify one thing with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Elijah took a slow step forward. You said Officer Brian Ruiz saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested. Correct? Carrington sighed, a look of exasperation on his face. Yes. And that testimony was recorded in his official report? Of course. Elijah gave a small nod, then turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to strike this testimony from the record. Grayson narrowed his eyes at him. Objection? For the first time, Elijah removed his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even present at the scene when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Elijah took another step forward. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to submit a request for Officer Ruiz's GPS data from that night. If his report states that he saw me in the car, then his location should corroborate that. He paused, letting the tension in the room build. But I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Grayson frowned, glancing at Carrington. Counsel? Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by a police officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Elijah shrugged, a casual gesture as if it hardly mattered. If Officer Ruiz was actually there, the GPS data will prove it. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. But if it doesn't, there was no need to finish the thought. Everyone understood his implication. Grayson watched him in silence for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution object to the GPS data verification? Carrington hesitated. The moment lasted only a second, but it was enough. The jury noticed, the audience noticed, and most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. Elijah took a slow, silent breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, how they manipulated the system, how they used tactics to sway the jury. And there was one thing he knew for sure. If Carrington was truly confident in his case, he wouldn't stall. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. Counsel? Finally, Carrington shook his head. No objection, Your Honor. But the shift had begun. For the first time, the room wasn't laughing. The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. Carrington flipped through his stack of documents, the polished confidence starting to crack. Your Honor, while we await the results from the GPS data, there remains an undeniable fact. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Elijah gave a small nod. His face remained expressionless. That's correct. He took another step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a moment. Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Elijah turned to the jury, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints on a car means I stole it. That's the story they want you to believe. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice still calm, controlled. But let's think logically. He paused, letting the words sink into the atmosphere. Suppose you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then hang it back and walk out. Hours later, someone steals that jacket. He looked directly at the jury. Does having your fingerprints on that jacket make you the thief? Several jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the audience whispered something. Elijah didn't give them too long to ponder. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven store, hours before the alleged theft. I was in that store with 3 friends. He paused briefly, then continued. And yes, as we passed the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked. But I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car, didn't drive it away, didn't steal anything inside. Just a moment of foolish curiosity. He let the statement drift into the silence, then followed up, his voice as sharp as a knife cutting through the quiet. Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his stack of documents, trying to find something, anything, to regain the upper hand. But Elijah wasn't finished yet. And while we're on the subject of fingerprints, let's talk about how that analysis was done. He turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist in charge of this case called to testify? Grayson blinked, clearly not expecting the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly replied, no. Elijah pressed his lips together as if confirming something he already knew. So let me get this straight. He turned to the jury. The prosecution is using forensic evidence to convict me. But they didn't think it was necessary to bring the very specialist who handled that evidence to court? Not give me the opportunity to cross-examine, to examine the chain of custody, or to question the accuracy of the analysis. He paused, his eyes sweeping over Carrington, who was clenching his jaw tightly. Elijah nodded, as if that said it all. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. The kind of sigh a person makes when they realize this case isn't as straightforward as they initially thought. But Elijah wasn't finished yet, because what he was about to say next would change everything. He took a slow step forward, his voice still steady but carrying the weight of what was about to happen. Your Honor, I would like to enter into the record a sworn affidavit from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? Elijah nodded. Yes. Mr. Charles Whitaker, the legal owner of the stolen Audi, provided a sworn statement to the police. But for some reason, that statement didn't make it into the prosecution's file. He turned to Carrington, staring him down. And I think I know why. Do you remember what Mr. Whitaker told the police the night his car was reported stolen? The entire room fell silent. Carrington's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was coming. Elijah didn't wait for Carrington to answer. Instead, he pulled out a copy of the interview transcript, scanned it quickly, then read aloud. I left the car running when I ran into the gas station. Probably some kid jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the guy the cops arrested. I saw the guy, and he was white. A wave of stunned silence washed over the courtroom. Elijah held up the paper. This is from the initial police report. The very report the prosecution conveniently forgot about. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this detail from his statement. The prosecution ignored it. And now they want the jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward quickly, scrambling to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Elijah shook his head. No, I wasn't caught in possession of the vehicle. I was arrested several blocks away, walking home after getting snacks with friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I didn't run. His eyes swept across the courtroom. The only thing that links me to this case is poor police work and prejudice. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. The case was falling apart, and everyone knew it. Elijah turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night, but the police found a young black man in the vicinity, and they figured that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. The courtroom was silent. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington stood motionless. His jaw was clenched tight. His face was flushed. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson sighed. He looked at Elijah for a long moment, then turned to the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that everyone in the courtroom would never forget. This case is dismissed. A moment of stunned silence. Then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted in shock. The other half sighed in relief. The audience murmured. Reporters ducked their heads to scribble furiously in their notebooks. Elijah didn't rush to move. He let the moment sink in. Let the truth permeate everyone in the room. Judge Grayson still clutched his gavel tightly. Grayson looked at Elijah, his eyes unreadable. There was something in those eyes that hadn't been there before, recognition. Perhaps even regret. Elijah met his gaze, then turned and left. But just as he reached the door, Grayson's voice rang out. Mr. Dawson. Elijah paused, but didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated, then finally spoke. You should consider. Career in law. Elijah gave a slight smirk. He didn't need to consider. He already knew his path. Outside the courthouse, the noise exploded. Reporters swarmed on the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust at him like sharp spears. Elijah, did you know beforehand that the case would be dismissed? What will you do next? How does it feel to defeat a seasoned prosecutor? Elijah pulled his hoodie over his head, silently walking past them. He didn't care about the commotion. This case was never about proving he was smarter than someone else. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, Monica, his mother, was waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. She looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, she shook her head, letting out a breath. Oh my God, you almost gave me a heart attack. Elijah chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. I had to take the risk, Mom. She looked at him for another second, then pulled him into a tight hug. You've always been so stubborn. The cameras continued to flash, but Elijah didn't care about them anymore. Across the street, standing next to his car, Judge Grayson watched quietly. His demeanor was different. No more arrogance, no more smirk. Instead, there was contemplation. He had thought this was just another case, another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he would remember this one. Because Elijah had done something very few people could. He made the system look at itself. And for the first time, it blinked. What was the lesson here? How many other cases had ended this way? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of prejudice, because of shortcuts, and a system more interested in closing cases than finding the truth? Elijah had the knowledge to fight. But what about those who didn't? This case wasn't just about one trial. It was about all the other trials. He knew what he had to do next. Next time, he wouldn't stand before the court as a defendant, but as a lawyer. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we make them. Hit like, subscribe for more stories that matter, and keep the conversation going. Because next time, the one standing before the court might not be Elijah. It might be someone you know. Justice isn't just about rules. It's about truth, and the courage to stand up and fight when everything is against you. If you were in Elijah's place, what would you do? Have you ever been misjudged or had to fight to prove the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can inspire others and create positive change. If the story made you think, share it with your friends and family to spread the message of justice and determination. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. Let's work together to build a world where truth and justice are always protected, one small but meaningful step at a time. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the help of AI. If there are any errors, please ignore them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.